discussion, Dr. Mehboob. Not only was it comprehensive, but I thought initially that the two books would not have any connection in terms of their diversity, but listening to you and listening to your discussion, I think they do converge on the issues of race, on the issues of class as well, which we addressed briefly when we talked about the British colonial aspect, and जब अंग्रेजों ने जो उनका attitude था locals, natives के साथ, and secondly the fact that you also talked about diversification and the diversity that this city offers, which is at the heart of the book that I'll be talking about. Not only does it talk about issues of race and gender, but intersectionality as well, and I'll go into the details of it. First things first, the author, since it is a little unfamiliar, so I might just introduce it first. Bernardine Evaristo is a Black British author, a female author, and she writes this book in order to speak about, in order to offer representation of this community to the wider world, to a wider audience. And the title, as it offers a certain intrigue and an interest to a lot of us. Girl, woman, other. So you see, these are three titles within one title. And I was talking to Dr. Amna Muchima, faculty member of the Institute of English Studies here. She's also sitting here today. And as soon as she read the title, she was not only drawn towards it, she was instantly curious to know what does it entail. And the discussion ensued, and we talked about the fact that in terms of gender and the division between the two gender, women are often looked at, as Simone de Beauvoir in her book mentions, as the other, in relation to the other gender. So these are also some of the issues that we talk about here. The book is a winner of Booker Prize in 2019, which is the highest and the most prestigious award in terms of novel in this particular genre in the world. So the recognition of the book is, it's one of the most critically acclaimed book of this author. Having said that, when such a prize and such an achievement it wins a lot of a wider audience, it casts a wide net in terms of audience, it reaches into global, it becomes global, which is why we have read it perhaps, because Bernardine Evaristo, as Dr. Mehboob Hussain also mentioned in his book, that it is always good to have the perspective of the author. And while I was reading this book and I was preparing to talk about it, I read a lot of her interviews, and in one of her interviews she says that there was a need, the conception of this book, it emerges from a need to be heard, particularly of the Black British women in the United Kingdom, because as far as the African American women are concerned, we have a fertile field now where writers like Toni Morrison and so on and so forth have produced mammoth literature when it comes to this community. However, when it comes to United Kingdom, Black British women are still unheard. You don't find a plethora of literature when it comes to them. This in turn makes you realize how other multiplicity, how other communities as well need to voice and write and need to be included within our region, internationally as well, and so on. So now briefly talking about the structure of this book comprises 12 chapters. These 12 chapters are the 12 women that are at the center, the driving force behind this book. So each chapter is dedicated to one woman and the evolution of that character. The women are aged from 19 years to, I suppose, 93 years old, and the time span of the book is almost 120 years, which means that the oldest character does not survive by the end of the book. And each chapter, since it is dedicated to the task of talking about singularly one woman, at the same time, it delves into a deeper insight of their past, their childhood, kind of measuring a trajectory of their growth and their experiences. This way, it gives you that singular perspective into each woman's life and provides a very broader view. So one argument that could arise, or one school of thought, that it limits and confines the book to only, let's say, 12 women. Another perspective which Evaristo talks about is that it expands your horizon because it offers a new perspective about women who have not written or contributed in the field of literature, or most likely whose literature has not been included in a lot of bookshelves, libraries, has not been published, has not reached a global audience. She is, by the way, the Booker Prize is almost more than 50 years old, and she is the first Black female author to have received it in over 50 years. And it's not that better books were not written before, but it is about who was in the room. It was about representation. And this time around, in 2019, when this prize was awarded to this book, the room had 4 women, 4 very strong women, who enabled this perhaps. And this is coming from a discussion on the book and its prize. What that led to was, of course, that we're reading it here in Pakistan today. So because once it reaches the Booker Prize, it reaches readings, it reaches The Last Word, etc. So, the reach is, it is global. Now coming to the style of this particular book, it is an experimental novel. But having said that it is experimental, please don't associate it to be a non-friendly or not, accessible to a common reader. Because sometimes when we choose to label and use stereotype brackets for a certain book, most authors tend to disassociate themselves with it. And Evaristo also talks about it, that although it is experimental in terms of form, it is not merely an experimental form, so look beyond it as well. The experimental form is that it is fusion fiction, and this particular fusion fiction, the genre has been invented by Evaristo herself, which means that she's the pioneer, the forerunner of this form. The form fusion fiction, how it actually unfolds on paper is that it emulates the style of poetry. And why does it do that? Because Evaristo, before being an established novelist, was a poet, was also an avid member, activist of theatre, and she started her career in that domain. It was only later that she found her niche to be a successful novelist. Now, in this regard, she writes prose in the way that it emulates poetry. So she removes the full stops from the poetic, from the prose, from this writing. And in removing those full stops, there's a certain fluidity that has rendered to the text. There's a certain outpour of emotions, perhaps not like Wordsworth's, the spontaneous overflow of emotions, but a very structured craft in prose that looks like poetry. So this is one way where she experiments. She also, I think it was the Literary Festival at Edinburgh, where she was talking about this book, and she mentions it literally. She draws a pattern like this, that the book flows on paper like this, which means there are no full stops which add friction to a narrative. There are less commas that stop you, make you pause. This renders a direct insight into the subconscious of the characters. And you take a plunge into, perhaps, if I may use the term, stream of consciousness of these characters. And this is also a very direct connection with the lives of these characters. So the purpose of literature, as the cliche goes, is to identify with these characters. So at one level, you identify with them. There is a certain universality because these are human characters. They're not angelic, they're not entirely villains, they're not satanic, but they're pushed to a limit where they are not dislikable. And this is the term that she uses. They're not dislikable, but you understand where they're coming from. What are the various factors that have determined or shaped their behavior? And this empathy that is required from human beings, that perhaps we are also losing in a way, is cultivated through literature. That is the underlying purpose, as like I said, the cliche goes. The other thing that in terms of going outside your comfort zone, going outside your niche and experiencing the life from another community's perspective. So we do want to read about our society, our representation, but if our reading offers a broader demographic palette, what happens is we as a reader, and which is the goal of any avid reader, we are drawn towards a broader worldview. So diversification, because we need to educate ourselves in terms of issues of race, in terms of issues of gender as well. The book was written in 2000, it was conceived, the idea, she started writing in 2013, but it got published in 2019. So there is there's a huge amount of time that was spent in the craft of this book. This time period is also the time when two of the most prominent movements in today's time and age also were at its peak, the Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. And these two movements, considering there was COVID across the globe, there was more presence on the digital space than the physical space, so it got momentum of another kind, right? So I'm sure you all identify with that. So by the time the book was released, it was the zeitgeist of this time and age. And like I said, that we were having a discussion, me and Dr. Chima, about the book, and we talked about the lynching in the United States post George Floyd's incident. And what that did was that not only did it open a debate, or at least a discussion about race, and the ensuing movement of Me Too again opened the discussion about gender, feminism and race become prominent again, where they had been, trashed down by the media by and large. People had started disassociated themselves from terms like feminism, but it got the momentum again. And there are not only, she doesn't talk about ideas that are far-flung, she talks about, like I said, these are flawed characters that she's writing about. So there is a critique of these movements as well. There is a critique of radical ideas, extremist ideas. At the same time, there is an understanding of intersectionality. Coming to this term now, the term was invented and coined by, the theoretical framework basically introduced by Kimberly Kirschner, who is a professor at UCLA and Columbia, if I'm not wrong. And the term, on the roads, on the roadmap, you have an intersection where a lot of different directions converge. So intersectionality offers disadvantage or prejudice for a certain group on multiple levels. So let's say if you belong to, and hypothetically speaking, let's say you belong to an African American group and you're also part of the suppressed gender, and the two meet. Now this is a complex scenario which does not fall in the paradigm of usual race issue. So this intersectionality is further explored by this book, because this book offers not only issues of race, but issues of gender, issues of political, social upheaval, and a convergence of all these, and hence it provides a very broad field for intersectionality to be at play, to listen to, etc. Moving on, I have a couple of excerpts to read from, and while I read them, since we also talked about the statues, and we have statues in the university as well, in Lahore, we have it across the globe, and Black Lives Matter was, it started the movement of toppling certain statues across the globe. We saw it happening in Europe, we saw it happening in the United States, we saw it happening in the United Kingdom. And a few of those incidents where it happened in the United Kingdom, where these statues were symbols of the slave trade, of oppression. Bernadine Evaristo also defends it in one of her interviews, where she says that it is the movement Black Lives Matter that has ensued a debate that has eventually made us question history, interrogate history, investigate history. One argument is that these statues should not be toppled, and we talk about statues that are controversial, so to speak, in the history. So, and since most of you are, you have an area of expertise in history here, unlike me, so I leave this to you, in terms of debate. One argument is that they should be left as it is because it's part of history now. What has happened has happened. And Evaristo questions, and this was, I think, in her interview in Hard Talk in BBC, and she says that if it was, then we need to question the history because we need to realize who was documenting this history. And we are all aware that at that time this history was being documented by the white supremacists. So it is our responsibility, and like I said, it's an open-ended question. Think about it. It is our understanding that we need to question and recontextualize that history. We need to investigate. We need to challenge it, disturb it. It's not a complacent society anymore, and it is through literature, like the discussion already ensued about it, where we understand the importance of literature. It is awakening, but awakening through an ideological awareness, not through shaped it to be like that. So now I'd like to read that excerpt that I was talking to you earlier. And again, this is about race and rather sad, but I'll leave that to your imagination. Naseema was visiting England for the first time since leaving as a small child, on her way back from a pilgrimage to Ghana, where she'd spent 2 weeks. It was her first time in the motherland, visiting Elmina Castle, where captured Africans had been incarcerated before being shipped to the Americas as slaves. The guide led them into a dungeon, shut the door. In the hot, suffocating darkness, he geographically described how up to 1,000 people were crammed into a space meant for 200, with no facilities or sanitation and little food or water. On the other hand, it doesn't merely talk about race and gender, it offers a lot about family dynamics, relationship, class, evolution of theatre, let's say. Because in the first chapter, one of the characters, who is Emma, and since these are, remember, the origin is different, so they're spelled differently from the usual English terms, because it's a different community that we're talking about. And she is a struggling director who has a theatre company, and she is going to talk about her experiences, her hypocrisy, her tumultuous understanding of family dynamics, living with the patriarch, at the same time living as a hypocrite, etc. So, not confined to these central themes, but offers much more, a variety of other things which make this book so reader-friendly, which make this book so popular. It has won a lot of other awards as well, not just this one, but I think this is the one that put it on the map. This is the one that perhaps made me choose it to read it. Another thing that, and I think after this I can wrap up, considering the time and everything. Diversification that we talked about earlier. A lot of publishing houses, a lot of academics, after the movement initiated, the Black Lives Matter, and the discussion ensued, they started questioning their policy. They started looking at their statistical data. Who did they employ? Who do they publish? What are the reasons and factors for it? And how does it feature into their practical life? And that is the difference that literature can make. That is the difference that that made people more aware and more conscious of including books which are not merely written by the whites, but perhaps other communities, Asians, blacks, African Americans, etc., etc. So there is just one more excerpt that I would read, and then perhaps we can open the house for question and answers. So, although the mother of his only child, writer and director, and dear, dear friend, could have made her name where it mattered a long time ago, if she'd taken his advice and directed a few multicultural Shakespeare, Greek tragedies, and other classics, instead of writing plays about black women, which will never have popular appeal, simply because the majority of the majority sees the majority, and which is through a lens that this will not develop you into a critically acclaimed writer, because this will not appeal to the masses. This is not what the reader is looking for. This is not what the publisher is looking for, etc., etc. So, and with that, I think I wrap up the discussion and I leave the floor for questions.
Thank you, sir.
Assalamualaikum everyone, I'm Nabiha Khan and I'm from the Department of Space Sciences. Alright, so I have a question, which is, the author, she started writing in 2013, and as we all know, the famous hashtag, it started in 2019. So the question arises, was she actually waiting for something as horrible as this to happen? Because why didn't she publish it before? Wasn't she not confident enough? That's my question.
Okay, I mean, she has published a lot of books. This is the book that puts her on the map. But she's an established author, and 8 books, if I count them, 8 novels. And she's a critically acclaimed novelist in the region and in the West as well. But this particular award puts her on the map for a wider audience, because we all look up to the Booker Prize. I mean, I teach at the Institute of English Studies, and every year we wait for who bags it, and that puts the book on the map. That does, definitely. So that popular appeal did, make it, did give it a wider audience. But the author has been writing for a long time, and she doesn't call or refer to this book as her finest work. She says that, it reached a global audience because the room had the right representation. Do you follow? And she started writing this particular book in 2013 and finished it in 2019. And the Black Lives Matter, and she also addresses this issue that the two movements happened, somewhere in between her writing process, which landed the book into that right domain. Okay, and which meant that it hit the zeitgeist, like I talked about. So, yes.
Zoya, we have a question from an online participant, Dania Ahmed, and I'll read out the question for you. The question is, how do you think the engagement, but first she has written, thank you for an intriguing session, Ma'am Zoya. And then she asks, how do you think that the engagement of a Pakistani woman with this text would help her in situating her own feminist ideas, given the huge differences between the culture from where this book originates and Pakistani culture?
I believe this is one of the most very good questions in terms of perhaps if I had more time I would have landed the discussion there, that the whole fact that intersectionality and one movement cannot be a after the second wave of feminism, where they felt that they were still not included in the movement. It wasn't for them. Then the bourgeois, the middle class, it offered more about the white women. It's centered and focused around their problems and their issues, and not the working class. Because the working class women in Africa, perhaps, at the time, they had a different scenario, they had a different experience with life altogether, so it did not fit the bill for everyone. Similarly, this makes us realize that as an Asian woman, as a woman from Central Asia, as a woman from South Asia, we have a different cultural paradigm, we have a different engagement with these issues. And our issues might not align with the issues that are in the West or in these cultures. Of course, in terms of humanitarian, the underlying argument remains the same, but at the same time, we need to find our own voice, we need to find our own perspective. And the only way we get that is when we write in academia, in literature, when we perform in theatre, when we write poetry, when we are heard, when we are published, and when other people, especially the supremacists, do not speak for us, that too. So, yes, I hope that answers the question.
Ma'am, I have a question. Firstly, I want to say very profound. Thank you so much for this. How do you see using a label like girl, woman, other in this context? That you also have the title of body to your name. You also have the title of other on the cover. So, does this do justice to the sort of inherent ideas that are ideas of resistance by using imperial titles, for instance, the Booker Award?
I understand the question, because and for those of you who are not perhaps familiar with the term, she's a literature student, so a lot of it is coming from a literature background, the questions. The other here is more, as far as my perception is, since I've read the book, is more in terms of how Simone de Beauvoir writes about other, and how women are still seen, or were still seen perhaps in the 19th century, through a different lens, and that lens needs to be, there needs to be a certain amount of equity, and there needs to be a certain amount of equal opportunity for all, which is the underlying principle here. Evaristo herself talks about a lot of important issues such as the dynamics between teacher and student, not devoid of race, devoid of color, devoid of religion. The dynamics between institution and students, devoid of these issues. So, like I said, this is not promulgating one particular movement, not at all. In fact, it's a critique. I mean, I think I've read more critical comments in this one of radical feminism than any other book. And then another author, like Margaret Atwood, who won the Booker Prize. This was a shared prize, by the way, by two women. So, Margaret Atwood for The Testaments and Bernardine Evaristo for Girl, Woman, Other. So it was a success for all around. Yes, I hope that answers your question.
Zoya,
Yes, Dr.
I
Amit.
just had to say something about it because we've been talking about it. So just a comment to what Rida and the other students also talking about, the concept of the other. So, it's more to Stephen as well, because I feel the other in the title is now addressing the idea of the speaking being much more than just talking about the traditional feminism. It's about how each time the feminism is curtailed within certain brackets, and we think about women and we think about rights, or let's say even in terms of race, we're thinking about lynching. But it's much more beyond that, because, it's largely a question of who is speaking what. So we need to understand, that's also I think the title highlights and intensifies, that we are speaking beings before being women. And a question to you now is that I strongly feel that, the timeline that she's tracing, and it's pretty cyclic because, the history is repeating itself, and lynching was always there. It's not something new. And the issue of race has also been there. So it's a repetitive act. So don't you think through these different timelines that she's tracing and bringing the characters together, she's also taking us to this new and happening concept of post-humanism. And that's also one way to counter the idea of the racial prejudice as well. Let's just merge these identities, the technology itself, the non-humanistic, definitions. Let's just then merge with them and see if we can make a breathing space for ourselves.
Yes, indeed. Not only that, I think because the issues of race, the issues of gender have always been there. And like we said, we'd stopped talking about it. We'd stopped associating ourselves with these terms. And they have kind of come back into the narrative because of the two hashtag movements that happened. But now that it happened, there's a different awakening in academia, at least, of these terms. There is a more nuanced approach because we have seen these movements failing as well. And the larger popular and resistance movements where a lot of marginalized segments have come together and associated themselves with one movement and so on and so forth. This is more about just living through these characters and hearing their voice. Perhaps less about identification with them and more about experiencing what they have experienced. So these are 12 female fictional characters, but 12 very different women who are flawed. Believe me when I tell you, you don't fall in love with these characters because they're not, but they're humane. They're pushed to that boundary, and yet you do try to understand where they're coming from, understanding the culture and the enigma around them.